I'm going to start this meeting. I'd like to begin by welcoming those members of the public or press who have joined us today, either in person or watching via the live stream, to this meeting of the Cambridge Joint Area Committee at the Guildhall in Cambridge. Both councils allow filming and photography at their public meetings, so please feel free to take pictures, tweet or blog during the meeting. But could I please request that members of the committee and the public turn their mobile phones to silent or vibrate whilst the meeting is taking place. Would the Democratic Services Officer report any apologies for absence?
Thank you, Chair. There are apologies from Councillor Beckett and Councillor Nethsinger is here as a sub. Councillor Bird and Councillor Ray is here as a sub. And Councillor Bagent and Councillor Bounds is here as a sub.
Thank you. So I think we may have three councillors. Councillor Moore, Young and Beckett might be joining us a bit late.
Who's Dave Bagent?
Does any member wish to declare any disclosable pecuniary interests or non-statutory disclosable interests? Councillor Robertson.
I need to declare an interest because I'm a resident of one of the existing parking schemes, the Asham scheme. Thank you.
Okay, I think what I'll do now is I'd like to introduce the committee members. So if you could introduce yourselves and say who you represent, maybe start with Councillor Shaler.
Yes, I'm Neil Shaler. I'm the Vice Chair of Highways on the Cambridgeshire County Council.
I am the County Councillor for Newnham and leader of the County Council, and my name is Lucy Nethsinger.
Lisa Meschini, I'm here representing King's Edges Division on the County Council.
Hello, Mike Black. I'm County Councillor for Artbury Division.
Cathy Ray, County Councillor for Castle.
Richard Robertson, one of the City Councillors for Petersfield.
I'm Councillor Dinah Pounds. I represent Romsey Ward.
Wrong one. Sorry, left-hand side, right-hand side. Councillor Philippa Slatter, County Councillor for Trumpington Division and Vice Chair of this committee.
And I'm Councillor Katie Thornborough of Petersfield Ward, and I'm the chair of this committee. I think we've got lots of officers here. So when the officers, when you start, if you come in, then maybe introduce yourselves before you. Is that a bit better? Yeah, I'll try to have the mic close to me. Okay, so we have Councillor Moore has arrived. Maybe you'd like to just introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry I'm late. I'm Councillor Rosie Moore from Coleridge Ward. Thank you. For the City Council.
Thank you. We'll now go on to item 2, minutes of the last meeting, 12th of June 2024. We are asked to approve the minutes of the last committee meeting, which was held on the 12th of June, as an accurate record. Can I ask whether any members disagree with the accuracy of the minutes? Okay, so I see no objections, so I will sign them as approved. On that basis, are committee members happy to? Oh, are members happy to approve the minutes? Do officers or members have any comments on the minutes action log? Okay, it's a very good, long, comprehensive action log, and I see that quite a lot of them have been dealt with already, and others are in hand to come to future meetings. So now Councillor Bennett, your seat is just down here at the front. Down the alleyway. So, Councillor Bennett, we've just dealt with the minutes of the last meeting, and the other members have introduced themselves. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Councillor Naomi Bennett, Abbey Ward.
Thank you very much. So we will move on to item 3, which is public questions and petitions. We've received 16 public questions, 13 of which were accepted and 3 of which were rejected because they were received after the deadlines for submissions. These questions will be heard at the start of the relevant item, with 11 questions, I think, well, maybe relating to agenda item 4, Milton Road Residents Parking Scheme, and 2 questions relating to agenda item 6, which is awaiting restrictions in Headley Road area. So, item 4 is to consider objections to proposed residential parking scheme in Milton Road area. The first report is on the proposed...
Sorry, Chair. Are we getting copies of the questions?
They are all on the agenda on the website.
Okay.
So the first report is on the residential parking scheme in Milton Road area, and it will be presented by the County Council's Parking Policy Manager, Nicola Gardner, and the Greater Cambridge Partnership Director of City Access, Lynn Miles. So we'll have those reports first, and then we'll have the public questions after that.
Thank you, Chair. The Highways and Transport Committee agreed that the GCP would develop and deliver residents' parking schemes across Cambridge City. The GCP prioritised 6 schemes, with the first of those schemes being this one, the Milton Road scheme. Lynn Miles, GCP City Access Programme Director, will present this report, which considers the objections received in relation to the proposed residents' parking scheme in the Milton Road area of Cambridge.
Thank you, Nicola. Thank you, Chair. As Nicola says, this is the first of the resident parking schemes that the GCP has developed in response to the County Council request. For those that aren't familiar, it's worth setting out where these have come from. The GCP, the Greater Cambridge Partnership, is a joint subcommittee of its 3 partner councils, which exists to deliver the Greater Cambridge City deal. So the partners are the Cambridgeshire County Council, which is the Highways Authority, Cambridge City Council and South Cambridgeshire District Council. And so the GCP's board and joint assembly include representative members of all those 3 councils, taking joint decisions on matters of shared interest alongside co-opted business and educational members. So following the County Council's request in 2021, the GCP board agreed that officers should design and implement resident parking schemes across the City of Cambridge, with the long-term intention of covering the majority of the city that's currently unregulated with regulated parking zones, and identifying a series of first priorities. And so these resident parking schemes are actually a shared endeavour between County Council and GCP officers. And just to explain the roles and how that works, the GCP, my team, develops the designs and engages with the local community in doing so. The County Council then deals with drafting the legal order, with advertising the TRO and making recommendations to CJAC in discussion with GCP. And finally, if and when the schemes proceed, GCP takes responsibility for the implementation and setup of the scheme, where county parking services then operate them ongoing. So it's a real partnership endeavour.
Lynn, can you just move your paper slightly off the mic? 'Cause, yeah,
Sorry.
thank you.
So this decision is coming before CJAC to allow both city and county councillors a chance to make a recommendation. The typical route for a TRO, a traffic regulation order, is that the Executive Director for Transport would take a delegated decision in discussion with the relevant members. And in this case, they will take account of the feedback from CJAC when they do so. This is the first such scheme to come to CJAC, but others are expected to follow, having followed a broadly similar approach. So just to set out the background to the Milton Road parking scheme, there was engagement with local members and residents groups on the initial design. With the agreement of local members, we went then out to consult on an initial scheme in autumn of 2022. We held a couple of public meetings, both online and in person, and received 313 responses to that formal consultation. Having reviewed those responses and had further discussion with local residents group, we made a couple of further changes to the scheme, the biggest of which was to reinstate parking bays on Arbury Road that we had initially suggested should be removed, and some other minor amendments such as additional double yellow lines or removal of individual parking bays close to junctions to improve sightlines. There was a road safety audit then on the revised proposals to ensure safety. On the basis of that, having secured the agreement of local members, County advertised a draft traffic regulation order for statutory consultation. Just to explain that slightly, there are these two different forms of consultation. So the initial one, carried out by GCP, was a formal consultation, but it specifically invites all feedback, positive or negative, for the purpose of helping to design the scheme. The statutory consultation, the advertisement of the draft TRO, is more of a statutory process. It's primarily designed to give the public the opportunity to make formal objections. It doesn't explicitly invite positive feedback. We received 381 representations to that. You have a paper before you which summarises all of this. Appended to the paper are plans of the recommended scheme, the draft TRO, summaries of objections and comments to both the first consultation and to the advertisement of the TRO, including specific representations raised by a resident of Havenfield. You have the designer response to the road safety audit issues, findings of the parking surveys and a qualities impact assessment. There is a summary of the key objections received during both the formal and the statutory consultation, summarised in the paper, and Appendix 3 to your paper also includes the officer response to those concerns. I won't detail them now. I suspect many of the public questions touch on some of the concerns raised. Overall, the paper advises that you recommend to the Executive Director of Place and Sustainability, in discussion with local members, to approve the introduction of the Milton Road resident parking scheme as published, and that because of the feedback received, you also at the same time approve a review of the scheme 6 months after it begins operation, with a view to including the northeastern side of Arbury Road if it's demonstrated that the scheme has capacity to do so. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. So, committee, we're going to have the public speakers, and then after that, the county and the county councillors or the city ward councillors can speak as well, and then we will go into questions and debate. Councillor Robertson.
Sorry to interrupt again. You told us that the questions coming to us today are on the website, but they do not appear to be so.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, no, we don't publish the public questions or circulate them because we don't require public questioners to submit the full text before the meeting, so we can't circulate them, if you see what I mean.
Thank you, I now understand, thank you.
Apologies for that error earlier. So the first public speaker is Mr. Andrew Milbourne. Is he here? Yeah, if you could sit there. So you have, I'd like to just remind you, you have 3 minutes to present your question or your comments. And we have this traffic light system here. So, and that will turn to amber 30 seconds before your time's up.
Okay, thanks.
Okay? So, thank you.
Okay, so I'm Andrew Milbourne. I'm the chair of the Hurst Park Estate Residents Association, and this statement is on behalf of the association. So Hurst Park Estate Residents Association has maintained a neutral stance on this issue and has not campaigned in favour or against the RPS. We have tried to engage constructively in the consultation, but we feel the consultation has been flawed. The only change that was made as a result of the consultation was in the Arbury Road parking. No other changes have been made at all. Even factual errors such as impossible parking spaces have not been corrected in the plan. Rightly or wrongly, residents feel they have not been listened to. Also, information we've been asking for the last 18 months was not provided until a few days ago. This included FOI requests which were simply rejected. If the CJAC committee does decide to recommend approval, then we request that there is a presumption now that the 6-month review is used to rectify the shortcomings in the consultation. Also, that the implementation does not preclude this. This is particularly so in relation to the following 3 points which they have repeatedly raised over many years by many people. This might increase support for the scheme. Firstly, we need shorter operating hours in the Hurst Park estate area, such as 10 to 2 p.m. This is mentioned many times in feedback. We were told it was not possible to have different operating hours in one overall area, but there's a precedent for this in Benson, so this was incorrect. Paragraph 2.4 of the officer's report states that the RPS is divided into 3 zones, so this would be possible, and this is clear in the street layout. Secondly, we don't want to have 80 signposts in the Hurst Park estate, as this will be a blot on the streetscape. There are many precedents for this, such as at Newnham. At the review, it would be possible to add signs if it was felt necessary, but it's unlikely to be possible to start with 80 and then remove them. It is also unlikely to be possible to change the operating times on 80 posts. Thirdly, the pay and display parking for Milton Road and Arbury Road shops in part of Arbury Road and Highworth Avenue is needed. All the businesses and people like caregivers will suffer. The parking in front of shops is all private land and use is restricted, in some cases with fines. With the scheme, the small amount of public parking in Milton Road will be reduced. Overall, a lot less parking will be available. Other questions, so how will it be patrolled? Will there be the officers to do this? Will there be sufficient resources for the 6-month review and any implementation required? Thank you.
Mr. Milbourne, that's spot on time. Thank you very much. And thank you for
I'm speaking for Michael Page as well. I don't know if you want to come back and do that one on call.
Yes, you will be back, yes. So we'll have all of the speakers and then we'll address the points. We'll ask officers to address the point. Was that better? Yeah. So, Mr. Paul Harvey, would you like to come forward? And whenever you're ready.
Okay, thanks. My interest in this is I live at Ellis House on Mulberry Close. It's a housing association. Most people there don't have very much money, and it's going to have a major negative impact on them. It must be said that, judging from the responses, 76% have said no to this scheme. I'm not quite sure what we're doing in this meeting, unless you propose to go against the majority of the people who don't want this scheme. However, what specific parking issues have been raised in Mulberry Close, and how will paying for parking mitigate them? Does the council envisage commuters using the area to park and then cycling to town or the science park? And if so, what evidence is there that they're doing this now or will do in the future? Excuse me. What was the forecast revenues for this scheme and what are the costs? What guarantees will there be that you simply won't use this as an excuse to raise tax instead of putting up council tax? Mm-hmm. There have been local elections recently. This matter could have been put to a referendum. Why wasn't it? Because you knew the result. Because overwhelmingly, this would have been rejected. CHS were supposed to have sent in their objection to this, and I understand that somewhere along the line it's got lost. I've been asked if I could read it out. It's very brief. This is from Andrea Sullivan, who runs the scheme. And she writes, I'm writing on behalf of the CHS group who own the above property, that is Ellis House. This is a sheltered scheme for age 55 plus, although we do have a car park that is very small and the tenants' cars overflow into Mulberry Close from time to time. One might be using it once a week, once every 6 months. I've only used it once in 6 months. Some of our tenants are on very low incomes, and by introducing parking charges would make their situation even more stressful and detrimental to their mental health and well-being. Please can you re-evaluate your decision to introduce such charges, as this is their home, and being able to park there should not impact on them or the people who come to visit them. Many of them have carers coming in, they have close relatives who need to park locally as well. This parking scheme isn't wanted, and it's not needed. I've lived in the area for 8 years, I know it well. Lees Road isn't a problem, Mulberry Close isn't a problem. The roads surrounding it are occasionally congested, but one can always drive through them. This is a money-making scheme, and this is as wanted as much as a congestion charge is, and that is not at all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harvey. Mr. Page, would you like to come back? Oh, no, this is not, Mr. Milbourne, sorry. Yeah. On behalf of Mr. Michael Page.
Okay, so this is a question from Michael Page on his individual behalf. Doesn't represent Apera. Okay, since the public consultation ended in November 2022, I've submitted FOI requests on 2 occasions for the results to be made public, but this information has been denied me for more than 18 months. I finally received an email last Monday advising me that the papers had been published for today's committee meeting, which gave me just 2 days to read the reports and submit comments or questions, which had to be in by 12 noon on Wednesday. So question 1, do members of this committee consider the time given to the public to read and respond to the papers for this meeting is adequate, fair, and in the interests of democracy? The papers reveal that 167 out of 312 respondents to the November consultation were in favour of the parking scheme, a 54% majority, and that the number of households surveyed was 1,515, a response rate of 21%. This means just 11% of all households in the zone were in favour. On the other hand, written objections to the TRO numbered 288 out of 381, i.e. 76%. So question 2, do members of this committee consider that this amounts to an adequate and sufficient mandate to proceed with the parking scheme as currently proposed? Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Milbourne. Now we have Mr. Andrew Barrett.
Hello, I'm here on behalf of the residents of Chantry Close, which lies just off Chesterton Hall Crescent. We have concerns, a number of concerns about the scheme. First of all, cost. A number of the residents run cars which need to be parked on Chesterton Hall Crescent and are concerned about the cost that a resident parking scheme will mean for them. But also safety. We have an area around the back of our close which is already blighted by nuisance parkers. But being a private estate, people who cannot find a parking space on Chesterton Hall Crescent, especially tradesmen, come and park on the pavement down the driveway to the back of our estate, blocking access to emergency vehicles. We've raised this objection twice during the consultation process and not had an adequate response. We believe that it could be addressed through introduction of railings down the side of our driveway on the curbside, and that would stop people parking on the pavement. And that is our primary concern. We have elderly people who live, and people with health conditions who live at the back of the estate. And just on Friday, the most recent incident, I had to go and ask a bathroom fitter to move his car as he was blocking access to the back of the estate by parking on the pavement. We feel that this will only be exacerbated when there are more limited spaces to park on the Main Street, Chesterton Hall Crescent. We'd like that to be considered and addressed.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. We have Mr. Anthony Reel. I hope I pronounced your name right.
Thank you very much. I wish to reinforce one point made by Mr. Milbourne, namely the length of time for which this scheme would apply if it were implemented. As you can see from the written representations, and as Mr. Milbourne has said, many people have argued that the proposed hours, 9:30 to 3, are far too long. And I think a shorter period, if the scheme were introduced, would be possible without undermining the objective of discouraging non-residents and especially commuters from parking. Around some outer London tube stations and overground stations with which I'm familiar, residents' parking applies along the following hours: Woodford, 2 to 3 p.m, East Finchley, 1 to 2 p.m, Epping, 10:30 a.m. to 2:30 p.m, Chingford, 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. These shorter hours have worked effectively for many years. The pressure from commuters there must surely be at least as great in those areas as it is in this part of Cambridge. As has been pointed out already, it is clear from the evidence provided with this agenda that there is not much enthusiasm among the residents for this scheme, to put it no more strongly. Another figure which might have been mentioned earlier, the summary of written representations about the detailed scheme from the Arbury Road, Hurst Park Avenue area shows 184 objections against 45 in support. Therefore, if the scheme is introduced, every effort should be made, I would argue, to minimise its inconvenience to residents and to proceed with the lightest of touches. Shorter hours would help significantly to achieve this, and I urge that at the most, if the scheme is implemented, it should apply from 10:30 to 2:30, as in Epping, preferably even shorter. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Miss Linny Purr.
Lenny Parr, on behalf of 53 Havenfield residents, a good number of who are here, and it's good evening from them and me, councillors. And thank you for giving us this opportunity to ask you, our elected representatives, to wade in and make things right for people. Thank you. This scheme will take away all our on-road parking within half a mile of our homes. When our car park's full, those who can't walk this enormous distance will be stranded. Residents won't leave their homes for fear of losing their car parking space, and visitors won't visit the same. What we do and who we see will be cut, and mental health will decline. Many of our residents have age-related mobility issues which are not eligible for blue badges. As one of our residents says, there's never a pain-free day after 70. We're all affected, not just car drivers. Excluded from the scheme means we get no permits for visitors, no medical permits for carers and family who are carers, no tradespeople's permits, they'll have to walk or pay. Car drivers will have no ability to charge any future electric cars there. The scheme is in defiance of county and city policies and UK law on equality. So, Havenfield residents are asking you to please, lost my spot, excuse me, that you reject the scheme, asking you to reject the scheme, or if you accept the scheme, include the northern side of Arbury Road in it, or if you accept the scheme and reject the northern side of Arbury Road, you draw a loop round Havenfield and include us in it because of our protected characteristics. May I draw your attention to the report and focus on the 3 reasons given for our exclusion. 1, it's stated, as a matter of balancing competing needs and impacts. This means that officers have unfairly sacrificed us for the aim of delivering parking controls across the whole city and to make room for parking spaces lost in the Milton Road project and in the roads near Mitcham's Corner. Reason 2 is that we would exceed capacity and negate the scheme's purpose. This is incorrect. There's no data to support this, and report evidence from WSP's observations on parking stress proves we won't exceed capacity. Reason 3 is that the northern side has enough private parking and that Havenfield has private, although inadequate, parking and therefore shouldn't be in the scheme. Incorrect. WSP's Technical Note 1 proves 70% of households within this scheme have private parking. If you'd like, please ask me for chapter and verse on this because I haven't got the references written down. WSP evidence shows that it's ridiculous for officers to say that the few cars from us on the northern side that will park in this scheme will render the whole thing a failure, and that the council can discriminate against us because we have private parking.
Ms Purr, do you mind if can you wrap up and
I
finish your
certainly can.
final comments?
I'm so sorry.
That's
yeah,
okay.
Certainly. I just wanted to say that finally, with this 6-month review, we're not convinced that officers will come back in 6 months' time and tell us that they're wrong and deliver it. And just thank you for your kind attention and for considering these points. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Purr. That is Mr Alan Hart.
Is the mic on already? Yes, it is. Okay. I'm Alan Hart from Herbert Street. We've been facing proposals to introduce residence parking since about 2016 at least. And the residents have been consistently telling the authorities that the scheme was going to be very disruptive because on Herbert Street it would remove, I think it's about 60% of the parking spaces. Herbert Street is a narrow Victorian street, and the scheme essentially tries to introduce something that goes beyond what would be required for a new build development. There are requirements, for example, in British standards and in approved document B on how close a fire engine needs to get to a new build property. The scheme seems to be trying to insist to go way beyond that. And I think in the name of A, the residence parking policy requirements, and B, fire engine access. In 2018, I and some neighbours conducted a car survey ourselves. It resulted in quite a large report, which I have a copy of here. We've never had a response from any of the authorities to that report. It's quite detailed. And the result of it now is that we're faced with this scheme going ahead with many, many objections from Herbert Street to the removal of all the spaces. There are various implications to those spaces coming out. It may sound trivial that, you're going to have to walk around the corner for your parking, but there's lots of consequences nowadays. We're all going to be using electric cars in future. That means we're going to need to charge them. And it seems highly inequitable that the residents of this one street in the scheme will not ever be able to charge those cars at home. There are various concerns have been expressed to me, about safety, walking home at night in the very poor street lighting that we have. And of course, there are accessibility problems as well. For anyone that doesn't have a blue badge, you may now have to walk quite a long way to get from your car. You don't have to go ahead with the draconian version of the scheme as currently framed. The residence parking policy allows variation from the road width standards in exceptional circumstances. It's there, I think it's section 8.1 of the policy. Department for Transport spoke to me and confirmed years ago and confirmed there is no statutory requirement for the county to make a change when a parking scheme is introduced, a change to the road width. And as I said, this goes beyond even what would be required of a new build scheme. Ian Manning, our county councillor at the time, consulted with Fire and Rescue and obtained this letter from the Assistant Chief Fire Officer in 2019, which said that with some access changes at the bottom of Herbert Street, they would be quite happy with only 6 spaces removed instead of 35 or so. That has been completely ignored as far as I can see. In fact, that is really the theme of this for Herbert Street and Springfield Road. We've been ignored all the way through. We've repeatedly said there aren't going to be enough spaces, it's going to be massively disruptive, and nothing has ever significantly changed about the scheme.
Mr. Hart, I'm sorry, Nick, could you wrap up your comments, please? Thank you.
We would like to propose that the scheme be redrawn not to put double yellow lines all down one side of Herbert Street if it's going to go ahead. There could be some small adjustments to allow for the bottleneck at the co-op end of the street. We would like you to treat this as the exceptional circumstances that they are. There are other streets in Cambridge that have been allowed to keep residents parking, even though narrower, on both sides of the street, such as Benson Street. And if you are absolutely blocked from doing this by lawyers, for example, then there are simple options to improve access as per the fire and rescue advice that I have here and I can share with it if anyone wants to see it.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask Dr. Jocelyn Scott, please.
Thank you. I'd like to begin with a bit of history. I was the County Councillor for West Chesterton from 2013 to 2017, the County Councillor for Arbury from 2017 to 2021, and the City Councillor for West Chesterton from 2021 to 2023. Throughout that period, in this area we're now talking about, from various parts there came concerns about commuter parking, and the commuter parking was particularly raised in relation to Herbert Street and Chesterton Hall Crescent. Those 2 streets were concerned about that and did want something done. Now, this scheme that's being put forward is a part of the Greater Cambridge Partnership Milton Road project. And from the beginning of the Milton Road project, there was an undertaking made to the local liaison forum, which I chaired, that mitigation would be brought in when parking spaces were removed from Milton Road, which they were to be removed. Therefore, it's the responsibility of the Greater Cambridge Partnership to introduce a scheme that applies to everybody in the area if the scheme is to be introduced, so as to mitigate against the removal of the parking in Milton Road. I just want to briefly refer to the problem of Arbury Road. Arbury Road was never ever in any proposed scheme. And then when I, as a councillor with my colleagues, did canvassing, we heard from Arbury residents that they did want to be considered and to have the opportunity to put forward their views. And that was why we then, in consultation with the Greater Cambridge Partnership and the officers, through the local liaison forum, undertook an engagement, an informal engagement, which included the whole of Arbury Road. And I have to emphasise, there was never ever any proposition put to me as a councillor for that area that the right-hand side going up from Milton Road would be cut out of the scheme. Never ever was that put. And in my understanding, my colleagues too did not learn that that was to happen until the traffic regulation order came out. And I just want to end on a couple of points, because Linny Purr read out these 3 grounds, and the first ground, in my opinion, is indirect discrimination, because the whole of that side of Milton Road is being treated the same. That means there's a rule that's treating them all the same, and it impacts differentially on the residents of Havenfield on the grounds of age and disability, potentially. There's also a lack of democracy. If the left-hand side going up from Milton Road is cut out of this scheme, they are denied their democratic right to have a say, if I can just conclude on this note, to have a say in any residence parking scheme. It's not good enough to say that they can have a say after 6 months' trial. We know that De Freville has never had a review. They were meant to have a review in 1 year and they didn't. So I'm not sure that this 6 months review will come. But they are deprived democratically because they belong to West Chesterton. West Chesterton councillors represent them. If they're not in this scheme, now I'm winding up, if they're not in this scheme, they won't have a voice in any scheme that's proposed from King's Hedges. They won't have a voice in any scheme that's proposed for the other side of Milton Road. And we can't sit here and deny a whole group, a whole half of a road, of the democratic right to have a participation in residence parking. It's absolutely egregious, and I can't believe it's happened, and it was never, ever put to councillors that this is what would happen. Thank you.
I'd just like to remind the people attending, watching, that this is, the clapping doesn't help really. I know that various people are appreciating what they say, but the committee members need to, this is we're definitely here to listen to the objections, and that's what we're doing for in all circumstances. Thank you. So, Miss Anne Gilpin. Miss Gilpin, we're going to give you a little bit more time as agreed. Thank you.
Press that, yeah. Anne Galpin, speaking as a disabled resident of Mulberry Close and as a director of Mulberry Close Residents Society Limited. I'm very sorry to have to raise procedural objections against advancing the scheme to the implementation at this time. The whole scheme has been the whole consultation has been inaccessible, and as the map, the hard copy of the map shown, which is there, you can get your own printout. It has not been accessible to me as a disabled person, to our many elderly residents who are digitally excluded, and I imagine the same may be true for certain people at Ellis House, who are our neighbours in Mulberry Close, and also at Havenfield. We raised many objections that were unfortunately omitted from the summary presented in Appendix 3, and they were not categorised as strict objections in Appendix 7. They are as follows. In spirit, we have not actually completed the steps in this process that were supposed to precede the TRO. There was no previous feedback on responses to the 2022 consultation. Gary Baldwin's email on Monday, 22nd of July, was the first we're aware of that disclosed the results of that earlier consultation. And the latest plans presented with the TRO contain little evidence that issues were taken into consideration. Moving on to the next stage now would erode trust in the consultation process. It was not sufficiently clear to our residents that that the 2022 consultation was going to be treated as a referendum. As a result, some neighbours thought it was fine to leave the task of raising issues to a smaller group of neighbourhood representatives, such as Hurst Park, Andrew, and Mulberry Close in our immediate, and Ellis House, sorry. This misunderstanding may have effectively suppressed the response rate, which has extra significance because the result was very close. Our Secretary Yung Ching Oi is unable to attend today's meeting, and given the short notice on this and the summer holidays, we have struggled to find other representatives to join me. Our Secretary, Mr. Oi, has written to Gary Baldwin and our ward councillors to please ask them to raise his objections with the committee on our behalf. Mr. Oy and I have done our best to engage constructively with any pre-TRO collaboration and TRO collaboration between us on the scheme's issues on behalf of our residents. But there's been very little feedback. Our ward councillors have done our ward city councillors have done their best to, as advocates for us. But the general election and local election purdah meant that we weren't able to proceed with meetings that we had specifically asked for with the officers who will be responsible for carrying out the scheme. The scheme at present stands to create new unwanted issues and devising impact on Marlbury Close, where we have a mix of private bays and public highway parking. We remain disappointed that the report and this meeting is held without any meeting of the scheme with the scheme leads that was proposed by our ward councillor Sam Carling, and previously it was always our ward councillors who did the best to advocate and to get us meetings. It was before the previous elections that Labour councillors had the only public meeting for us at Milton Road Library and made, I can't remember the date, but thank you to them. We thank all of our councillors for their advocacy and their work on this. But it was particularly disappointing to learn after the fact that Marlbury Close Residents' Society were not invited to a 29th of January meeting held about the consultation and confirmation of the TRO process of the scheme with Lynn Miles. I don't want to water down our outright objection. If it has to go through, ours should be shorter. There should be no marks on the road. And as a disabled resident, the proposed parking scheme, with its limitation to blue badge recognition for disabled residents and added complications for facilitating visits from support workers or informal carers, does not reflect the social model of disability or the lived reality of my and many disabled people's lives, where reliance on visits from family and friends is a lifeline to keeping us out of crisis. I note that my own response in the report, which I've only just had sight of, the summary of objections, was significantly truncated. I know I'm out of time, so I can't read out, but I would be happy to leave with the councillors the full version of my report, of my initial response in 13th of April, I think it was. And I think that I think it needs to be back to the drawing plan and to consider whether this scheme is actually something that we need post-pandemic when the whole parking situation has changed dramatically. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gulpin. Thank you very much. So we have Mr. Martin Lucas-Smith, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm speaking as a user of Milton and Arby roads on foot and cycle. I'm not speaking on behalf of any organisation. I'm mainly here to speak on a later item, but I wanted to make one comment on this item. I support these proposals, but they need to go further. Residence parking is not purely a local resident matter, but also a strategic highways issue. If you're serious about managing population growth in the Greater Cambridge area of around 28% over the next 15 years, frankly, it would show complete lack of joined-up thinking to continue to allow free commuter parking here. You're about to complete a very sensible and long overdue scheme to improve Milton Road for modes other than the car. However, it would be completely ridiculous to be investing 24 million on a scheme to reduce car commuting, while at the same time allowing free car commuting within walking distance of the city centre. For Milton Road, removing the pavement parking, known as residence parking, is a huge improvement. But my comments, however, focus mainly on Arby Road, where the proposals frankly do not go far enough. With the exception of a properly designed lay-by for the shops, there should be no parking permitted at all. Arby Road is an anomaly in the city. It is the only main through road that has any car parking along it. The only exceptions are Chesterton Road and Queen's Road, and in both cases they have specially created parking bays to provide extra width. As a result, on Arbury Road, which has no such width for such bays, we see chaotic movements as children and adults have to veer out unsafely around parked vehicles. And pedestrians encounter cars on pavements because the road isn't actually wide enough to allow proper parking anyway. As a result, the vast numbers of people who cycle, particularly school children, who could benefit from the new Milton Road and Arbury Road cycleways, are determined by a danger spot between the two. Arbury Road is being given a special privilege that no other residents of any main road in the city are being given, to be given free public space to park their car at the public's expense. If you live on a through road like this, you should not expect to be able to park directly outside your house. Newmarket Road residents don't expect that, and they don't get it. Hills Road residents don't. Trumpington Road residents don't. I could go on. Almost all properties on Arbury Road have space on their property to allocate car parking if they wanted to. It should not be the role of the council essentially to provide free gardens by allowing people to store their private property on a significant highway, instead blocking the general public. This scheme should be amended to remove Arbury Road parking entirely and fill in the missing cycleway link and restore pavements to pedestrians. May I point out one error in the officer report? The TRO process provides no basis in law for positive views to be expressed formally, nor were these advertised. So it is wholly inappropriate to present a for or against percentage, as those in favour will be suppressed due to this legal basis. Lastly, may I say how good it is to have an AJC again, and thereby for Cambridge people to be deciding Cambridge matters, not rural Fenland councillors. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, that was a lot of comments, and I'd like to thank all the speakers who took the time to come in. That was a lot of comments, a lot of questions, and before there will be time for the councillors to speak, but I think we should go to the officers. So committee, listening to the residents coming in. Now, I hope you'll be patient while the officers go through the many points and questions raised. So I'd like to hand over to Lynn Miles, and you do what you answer the questions or pass them on to your colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I will try to do these justice. If I turn around to speak to the people behind me, then my microphone won't pick me up, so I'm not ignoring you. I just need to look this way so that you can hear me. The first question from Mr. Milburn made a couple of points and asked a couple of questions. So one of the key questions was about whether or not we can vary the charging within subzones of the scheme, and cited the example of Benson in doing that. The challenge of splitting a zone like this into three is, number one, it sort of causes problem on boundaries. All schemes in all places cause challenges around the boundaries because you always have to put it somewhere, and there are always some difficulties. So it increases the risk of sort of causing problems at the boundaries. Drivers might choose to park in a street with shorter hours or sort of move around, and it increases pressures. And it's confusing as well, and ideally schemes need to be as sort of straightforward and simple as possible. And the reason for the zone is to sort of balance parking needs around the wider area, and so the more you subdivide it, the less you're able to do that. On the amount of street furniture and signage, there is some flexibility here, but DfT does issue guidance, and we will normally follow that. As again, if signage is unclear or inadequate or inconsistent, it's quite likely that there will be challenges to PCNs that are issued, or just people, not complying by accident rather than by design, which isn't what you want from a scheme. The purpose of the scheme is not to catch people out and issue tickets, but to make it very clear what does and doesn't work. If I may, at the end, I'll pass over to my colleague on the questions about enforcement, but I'll carry on a little bit now. In terms of the sort of, I think a couple of people made the point that the scheme generally they felt wasn't needed. It's helpful perhaps to remind members that the scheme was initiated in line with conversations with local members, motions by the local liaison forum and so on, and that was then prioritised through a technical process by GCP in terms of which areas of the city would go first. So Hurst Park and Elizabeth area were identified for a number of reasons, including parking issues and obstruction to footways, observed pressure on the streets, lots of feedback from local people, safety issues with emergency services access, actual sort of requests from councillor support, and also interaction with other GCP schemes, in this case, as a couple of people have mentioned, the Milton Road scheme. So that's the reason for its development and its prioritisation. Someone raised a point about carers and visitors to people in Mulberry Close in sheltered housing, and it's worth flagging that for those that do need medical visits, there is a carer's permit available, and I can pass to my other colleague to sort of set out some details of that shortly. In terms of the questions around consultation responses and the date that they were published, it's common practice to publish all the documents together for a decision like this. And so we have published all of these things together to allow members to take them in the round and make a decision on the recommendation. But it's pretty common practice, the consultation results at the time you ask members to take a decision. One of the later questioners set this out, but he's correct to say that whilst the first formal consultation solicits all feedback, positive and negative, to help us design the scheme, the TRO does not invite people to speak in preference or in support of the scheme. And so we presented the breakdown of the people that did speak in support versus speak in opposition, just as a point of fact. But Mr. Lucas Smith is correct that you shouldn't infer that as a percentage support versus opposition. And again, the percent support in the formal consultation in 2022 was 54% in support. It's worth noting that the county used to require that there was 50% support for a scheme. That's been modified. There doesn't have to be. It isn't a referendum. And the decision on the scheme is not solely made on the feedback of people through consultation. Other factors can play a part as well, including questions of whether there are things like emergency services access that are just health and safety issues, as there are on some of the streets in this area. There were some questions around impacts on Chantry Close and indeed on Mulberry, which is around how you deal with private or unadopted space within a residential parking scheme. And there's a couple of things to say there. The overall is just that there is no power to enforce parking on a private unadopted road or parking space. And so we just can't, sort of enforce on there in the same way. That said, where there are private roads or private spaces within a scheme, because the whole zone is signed and clearly set out as a residential scheme, that's probably going to increase awareness. Firstly, that drivers ought to be parking in marked bays, not just anywhere. Secondly, that fewer people will enter the zone and look for parking if they're not a resident, if they know that the whole area is a resident parking zone. And thirdly, we've introduced double yellow lines, for example, around the entrance to Chantry Close and in a few other places. So we hope overall there will be a beneficial effect to enforcement, but ultimately it's for sort of the owners of private land to enforce if there is problematic parking on their land. On the point about Arbury Road being included or not included in the scheme, that is correct. Arbury Road wasn't included in initial consultations. It was then included, but the bays on the southwestern side were taken away, and the point of that was to increase cycle safety, to allow space for an advisory cycle lane along there. There was quite a strong response to that in the consultation, and so as a result of that, on the basis of consultation with local people and another informal public meeting, we reinstated bays on the southwestern side of Arbury Road. But it's worth being really clear that at no point in the formal consultation or the TRO was there ever a sort of formal scheme proposal that included the northeastern side of the road. So although it's clear that some people might not have been aware that the northeastern side of the road wasn't included in the scheme, that was always set out in the consultation, so there's been no change of that. And indeed, in the first consultation in 2022, we did have responses from residents of the northeastern side of Arbury Road, and indeed from some residents of the Havenfield, asking to be included in the scheme. So they definitely were aware of that time, and we considered those responses really carefully. But the information has always been out there. In terms of the scheme hours question, I acknowledge that that is always a trade-off, and this has been partly covered in the report. We received responses both to the consultation and to the TRO advertisement, both that the hours were too long and that the hours were too short. And so we are always trying to balance these things. Some people asked that the scheme also include evenings and weekends. Our view was that a Monday to Friday 9:30 to 3 scheme is a decent compromise, because it means weekends, after school and evening, visitors don't need permits. But we have proposed a review at 6 months, and so that's an opportunity to pick up any issues with operation, including hours. I'm going to come back to Havenfield at the end, if I might, and take all those points together. In a moment. Don't want to miss any. In terms of Herbert Road and Springfield Road and the move to single-sided parking, we've had quite extensive conversations with the fire and rescue services over the last year or two to confirm the approach that we're taking. They're happy with the approach. They confirm that they do need changes in order to be able to access the road because of width constraints. I really acknowledge that bringing in a resident parking scheme and reducing the number of bays on some streets means that some people will have to walk further to get to their cars than they currently do, and that for some that is an accessibility problem. And it's just one of those difficult issues where we also have to trade off with the accessibility problem of sort of pavement and verge parking and other things, and people's inability to park anywhere near their house because of other parking in the area. So there aren't straightforward answers to that. This is sort of set out in the Equalities Impact Assessment. There are just judgments to be made, and as officers we've made our recommendations to you on balance of that, but we're not sort of unaware that there are some tricky challenges. In terms of the accessibility or otherwise of the consultation, we do our best to make them accessible. So good practice is that both online consultations and in-person consultations can be, in their own way, inaccessible. And so good practice is to try and do both, which is what we did. We publish electronic materials, but we also put leaflets through doors of the people proposed to be inside the zone. We have online sessions, and we also have in-person sessions, and so we try to balance that. But we do always, we recognise that we won't always be perfect. We welcome feedback on what elements of the consultation people found difficult to access. On the question of whether the scheme is even needed post-pandemic, that's a really interesting question, actually. We do know that traffic fell away quite dramatically during the pandemic. We've done some quite sort of in-depth analysis with the university of how traffic has come back and the patterns with which it's come back. And it's clear, most of the data that we have at the moment suggests that the pandemic sort of did a drop and a pause, but we're now getting back to the curve. And so the sort of increase in traffic we expected to see in 2019 has been delayed by several years, but that it is now coming back. And some of the data from the most recent periods that we've looked at suggests that it's coming back quite differently at the moment. So it's coming back more strongly on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Friday, oddly, there are fewer cars, but more traffic. So there are different patterns, I acknowledge that, and we don't know if that change has finished changing and if we will revert to the normal we had before COVID or not. So we're keeping an eye on it, but the point of this scheme is to sort of future-proof for what we expect to be very large growths in travel demand due to the increase in population and employment in this area, which is a good thing in many ways, but raises challenges. To come back more specifically to the Havenfield question, if I may. In general, want to reassure residents of Havenfield. I understand that they feel we haven't listened to their concerns, and I understand why they feel that. I want to reassure residents that we have thought quite extensively about this. We've spoken to lots of you, and we recognise the concerns that you've raised, and that's why we've suggested the 6-month review, because if there is capacity in the scheme to pull in the northeastern side of Arbury Road, that would seem to be a good thing to do, but there is a risk that there isn't capacity in the scheme, and that we will bring in a scheme that just doesn't work to deliver the outcomes that people need to work. And although not everyone has a parking space, most people on the north of Arbury Road have a parking space of some form off the road. And so that is the balance that we did. We are proposing a very detailed and a very much real 6-month review. Our intention is that we would set up a mailbox of comments. Again, for residents of Havenfield, one of the comments we've had back is we know you're worried that we're somehow asking you to keep logs of every time you can't find a space. That isn't the intention. Your concerns are sort of noted, logged and understood. We're not asking you to prove them. What we would do if the scheme were approved and went forward is check in with you nearer the time to understand how it's playing out with you. But the intention would be to open a mailbox for comments on this and any other issue. Excuse me. To commission more parking surveys to compare to the before parking surveys so that we can understand how traffic patterns have changed. It is difficult for us to predict how that sort of move will be around the zone. We know some people in some parts of the zone will overspill into others. We don't quite know the patterns by which that will happen. And you can never fully know how much of the traffic will be removed because it's in fact commuter parking and how much will be retained. And so that is our proposed compromise to members, but you are of course here to discuss that and decide whether you think that's the right compromise. I think that has covered most points. If you'd give me a minute just to double check. The disability and the discrimination point. Look, equalities impact assessment and understanding impacts is not a straightforward tick box exercise. And as I said, we're balancing different considerations. On the specific point that we're treating different parts of the street differently, despite the fact they have different residents, I do understand that point. Equally though, we're designing a scheme that should go on for some time, and we can't know who will live in those properties. So although there is a sheltered accommodation here, the rest of the properties on Arbury Road, we don't know who lives in them now, we don't know who might live in them in the future, and so that undermines the case for differentiating the approach. I think that has covered most of the points that I wanted to make on that. If I just ask colleagues to come in on the point about whether the schemes make money, I should clarify that the Greater Cambridge Partnership has agreed to fund all the design and setup and implementation costs, which in other schemes in the past have been sort of levied as a scheme joining fee on people, and that won't be the case here. And Nicola can perhaps talk about operating costs, and then perhaps my colleague here can just talk about the variable hours and the how that does or doesn't work in different subzones.
When it comes to permit fees, they do need to cover the cost of providing the service. There is no intention to use it as a money-making exercise. It's to cover its costs, and it also can be used to manage traffic demand. I think there was another question about enforcement. So initially, when a scheme goes in, there will be probably a heightened level of enforcement. There'll be warning notices for a couple of weeks, just to give those people that are parking that are non-residents the opportunity to relocate. And how enforcement will go after that will depend on the scheme. It'll be sort of see how things go. So they will be enforced, and as I say, initially it'll be quite heavy to start off with. I think there was another one about free medical permits. So those people that are receiving short, medium care in their own homes, there is a free medical permit. That's available to, professionals and family who are providing that care. Residents within the scheme can apply for that. They'll just need some sort of acknowledgement confirmation from their doctors when they make that application.
I just want to come in because I just want to let the people who've spoken, the committee members have listened to all of the points raised by residents and associations. And these are generally, as you know, points of objection. The committee members will have heard what you've said, and they will be listening to the answers. And if they want clarity or if they don't agree, they will raise them. So I'm afraid I can't take any more points, and I can't take. The committee members will listen to all of the points raised, and they're listening to the answers, and then there will be more debate and discussion. So I'd like to continue, please. So, are there any other, is there someone else going to make the point about the, okay. So, committee members, that was, again, yes, yes, hours.
I'm Gary Baldwin, Policy and Regulation Engineer. I think we answered the one about the operational hours. Yes, they can vary across the city. They do vary across the city. We've got some, like, for example, Newnham, that's got quite short operational hours. I think they're 11 a.m. to 2 p.m., something like that. But then we've got some 24/7 schemes, because if schemes are closer to the city centre, generally you have longer hours, possibly including the weekends, because you've got potential for shoppers on a Sunday as well. Whereas if you've got a problem that's primarily related to, say, railway commuters, then you only probably need a Monday to Friday scheme, because you don't have problems at the weekend. And by excluding weekends from a permit scheme, then it allows obviously visitors to come along at the weekends and evenings and not have to pay for a permit. So yeah, so it's kind of making a judgment as to the area and the sort of parking patterns in those areas.
Okay, thank you. So members, I'm not going to bring you in yet. Hope you're making notes. I'm going to ask the division councillors and city councillors to come forward. But Councillor Pound, I thought you might need to leave. When are you going to have to leave?
I am already late for my other meeting, and it depends how much longer you think this item will go on.
I think it's going to be some time.
Will you be, is it okay if I leave? Thank you.
So I'd like to invite the councillors to come forward. I think we have Councillor Richard Swift would like to speak.
Thank you.
So I don't think there's a time limit, but I hope you can be fairly concise.
Oh yeah, I'll be about 3 minutes, I think. Thanks, Katie. Well, first of all, I'd like to say that we need to do something about parking, and so I'm not against everything to do with parking. Oh, sorry. I'd just like to say that commuter parking is a problem in Westchester, the ward that I represent, and I'm not against all things that are trying to I'm not, well, anyway, what I'd like to say is, first of all, that I don't agree with Lynn Miles about her assessment of the history of this scheme. Sorry, I'll just speak a bit nearer to the thing. The whole of Arbury Road was always included in the original informal engagement. I have a letter here from the 25th of April 2021, which is when Councillor Scott and myself actually were looking into exactly this thing in Arbury Road and Herbert Street. And it shows that Arbury Road was always part of the original informal engagement. This letter is dated the 25th of April 2021. Later, in April, a bit later after this was done, then the GCP came up with a slight variation on that. But it was always part of the original informal consultation. That's the first point. We got proof of that as well. The second thing is a little bit of background. I want to speak on behalf of Havenfield residents who have used Arbury Road and Lees Road for many decades for off-site parking. That's partly due to the history of Havenfield, which was originally built with inadequate parking spaces for sheltered accommodation residents. And the Apira catchment area of Hurst Park Estate has always been very, very decent in allowing residents and children and grandchildren and carers from Havenfield to park in the Hurst Park estate. There's never been any objections as far as I know. And that's a nice generous spirit from HEPIRA, the Hurst Park Residents Association. If the current scheme is implemented, Havenfield residents will be deprived of any off-site parking. Now that is clearly wrong. They're part of West Chesterton. They were a part of the original informal engagement, and they mustn't be excluded from that. Havenfield is a retirement complex with limited on-site parking for the reasons I've just said, requiring carers and children and grandchildren to find additional parking 1/3 of a mile distance if the current scheme were to be implemented without their inclusion. This is not practicable and it's not equitable. Another point, Hurst Park, Asham Road and Elizabeth parking schemes are part of the Milton Road project. I live in Gilbert Road, which is part of the Asham Road project. I was working with Councillor Scutt all the way from 2013 until she stopped being a councillor a couple of years ago. Door knocking, talking to residents. We really do know our area, our patch. The next point is the Milton Road Local Liaison Committee, comprising city and county councillors and representatives of resident associations, have been assured from the outset that residents' parking requirements would be fully and adequately addressed with implementation of the project. And finally, the scheme as currently proposed overlooks and ignores the undertaking. As a city councillor, I take responsibility for representing my residents, and officers should ensure that the scheme that is implemented eventually works for all residents. So my question is, I'd like to speak in support of Havenfield residents in my ward of West Chesterton who are anxious to be included in the Hurst Park Estate residents parking scheme. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Councillor Swift. I just want to remind members that the officers are speaking on behalf of their organisations. They're not speaking on behalf of their individual opinion. So yes, I'm just telling the committee that the officers are speaking on behalf of their organisations. They're not expressing their own opinion. So now, Councillor... Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think that point was made earlier. Thank you. So yes. So, Councillor Black, you are a division councillor, would you like to make some points as representing the residents?
No, I don't want to make a contribution at this moment, thanks.
Okay, so committee, then we could open up to questions and debate. So, Councillor Robertson.
Thank you. I have a few comments to make and some questions. Firstly, I was a resident of George Street for 10 years, many years ago. I'm very aware of the problem of parking in that street and nearby streets. I often found I had to go and park in those other streets because there is not enough room in George Street. Asham Road was often end up where we ended up. Unfortunately, of course, that's not available to them at the moment because it's a separate scheme, but it will be if this scheme is implemented. The question of commuters in London travelling into London from the suburbs of London is a very different position from the position we've got in Cambridge. Commuters here can choose their time and they can come and go during the day. Commuters going into London, that's them for the day gone. So 1 hour parking in that area would be appropriate. But 1 hour for this area is not appropriate. And I can tell you, before the Asham scheme was implemented, there were a lot of commuters parking in the Asham area, and they all got chased out when the scheme came in. I have a question about Mulberry Close. One of the residents mentioned that there were problems with disabled parking in Mulberry Close as a result of the proposed scheme, And I didn't understand what the problem could be, because if it's an adopted highway, there's a recognised scheme for people with blue badges to get a parking space on the highway. Possibly it's not highway they're talking about, maybe it's private land. But I didn't understand what the problem was. I think we need to know, because it's disabled parking, it's important. Milton Road, yes, I think we have an obligation to the residents of Milton Road who used to park on the sides of the road, who can no longer do so. So I do think we must recognise we have that obligation and must do something about their position. Herbert Street is a major problem to my mind. I'll come back to Havenfield, as I know it's a problem as well. I had a good look at Herbert Street over the weekend, trying to see what the problem is. The problem is, even though there are some larger vehicles that can get through, it's not 6.7 metres wide, which is what it needs to be to allow parking on both sides. Most of the street is 6.11 or 6.15 wide, so it's 60 centimetres short, in other words. 60 centimetres is 2 foot, that's a lot. I can't see that we can do much about this, I'm afraid. The other possibility I thought of was that when both sides of Herbert Street have a dip down into the gully, there's a very strong camber on that road, which means the vehicles tilt outwards, which means they're further apart, higher up, which is probably why they don't get so many so much damage to their cars as you might get on a flat road. Because the wing mirrors, for instance, are further away than the tyres. It's an odd position, but if you look at the street, you'll see what I mean. So I'm afraid I can't do much about Herbert Street. The position will be that, as with George Street, if you have to park somewhere else, you have to park somewhere else, if the scheme went ahead. I have a question about Havenfield. Somebody told me that it would be possible for carers to be able to park within the zone scheme that we're talking about. That seems unlikely to me, but perhaps the officers can confirm. There's no let out for carers under this scheme we're proposing to produce. But that's something I certainly think we'd like the answer to. It seems to me, having looked at the Havenfield Road, much of it is private road and should be possible to reorganise the parking down there if the people who own the road were prepared to organise themselves. That's not going to be a vast improvement, but it would help a bit, I think. I strongly believe they should have a go at it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Robertson. Have Councillor Maccini, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. I am myself a scheme adjacent councillor, representing as I do King's Hedges, but I have talked to both my colleagues, Councillor Bird and Councillor Carling, this morning. They were here. So I will open with the comments that they have made, which are pretty much identical as follows. This scheme has been worked on for quite a long time. We have all spent quite a long time with the officers, both the County Council officers and the GCP officers, trying to find a compromise solution for all the feedback that we were getting. And the feedback that we got in 2022, which was already post-pandemic and in fact quite pandemic adjacent, was extensive and very, very useful and important. We have got, so both Councillor Carling and Councillor Bird feel that absolutely something must be done, and turning down the scheme today essentially would mean going back to the drawing board and having absolutely no scheme coming forward. This to coincide with the end of the Milton Road roadworks would be unideal. The reason we came forward with a scheme that has an inbuilt 6-month review is effectively to allow us to work around some of the constraints that we have now, which don't allow us to go forward immediately with a scheme that includes parts of the northern side of Albury Road. I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I actually think that had we, with the data of the 6-month implementation review, we would probably be able to include quite a lot of Albury Road in it. That is my instinct. Because if you've got some flexibility around capacity, then there will certainly be parts of Albury Road in the north that will be able to come in. And you, at that point, can do another consultation, which would take a considerably shorter time than the thing that you would have to do now if you were going to design the scheme from scratch. Now, it is very important to realise that it is absolutely terrible, and I don't know exactly how we end up in this position when you've got a shelter housing scheme that is inbuilt with planning acknowledgement of far less parking spaces than the residents need. This is a problem, but there isn't anything that we can do now. What we can do is to get the data that will allow us to include you in the scheme. This is what I want, and this is what the 6-month review will allow us to do. We can't do it now. It's not policy consistent, but it will be if we go forward with the recommendations that are in front of us today. So this is most of what I've got to say. I have listened very carefully to what has been said. It's been very useful. I reserve the right to make some further points when I've heard more of the debate. But I think it is very, very important that we don't underestimate the problems that we would have were we to scrap the work that has been done over the last 3 years and start again. Thank you.
Thank you. I think before we go on to we have 2 more committee members. I think we'll come back for some of those answers. So Councillor Robertson was asking about whether there was a way carers could have park within the residential area. I think that was the main point. And then Councillor Maccini was talking about the 6 months review and what was possible, but also if this committee wanted to, said that the Havenfield had to be included, the implications of changing the red line. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'll let the Mulberry Close resident come back on the question about what the specific disabled parking problem is that they set out. On the carers question, the answer is that you can get carers medical permits if you live inside the boundary of the scheme, and so that would apply to people that need carers in the scheme. It wouldn't apply to residents of Havenfield because they would be outside the scheme. I realise that that is suboptimal. We did, as part of the response to consultation feedback, look to see whether there are ways that we could, whether within policy we were able to do anything, and there isn't anything we can do within the current policy. On the question of going back to the drawing board, the 6-month review and the constraints around that, just to say that if we can't advise that you can change the boundary without another consultation. It would need to be a mini consultation with those most directly affected. We don't have capacity to carry out that consultation until around November because of the impact of 2 elections in a row, and then the summer holidays mean that there are several consultations sort of backed up and ready to go in September. It's just we sort of don't have the capacity to run as many as we would like simultaneously. So that would be a sort of back to the drawing board timescale would be to consult in November.
Okay, I'm just looking back at my notes to find out who was from Mulberry Close. Would you like to come and forward, Ms. Gilpin, and
Thank you, Chair. I'm not so good at on the spot thinking. Can you reiterate clearly the question that I meant to be answering? Thank you.
I'm actually going to ask Councillor Robertson, who asked the question. He wanted some clarity. So if Councillor Robertson could, he'll ask what he wants. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Councillor Robertson.
I didn't understand what you were telling us about the problem of people with disabilities being able to park in Mulberry Close. You told me that I think you said there was a problem which would be caused by this scheme. Could you explain what it is?
It's not just Mulberry Close, it's to the whole scheme, and particularly I wasn't even aware of Havenfield not being included because I haven't had time. 2 days, if you're able to process print documentation to register submissions, is not sufficient, is not accessible. I know that Gary Baldwin has sent me hard copies of the documentation, but it has not arrived in post. So the Democratic Services and Gary Baldwin are doing their best, but the whole process is inaccessible, the timing of this. Now, I'm talking about the social model of the presenting officer came back with the comment that there are carers permits. The whole thing about the blue badge and the carers permit scheme is that they impose further barriers on people who are already confronted with huge barriers on day-to-day life. The barrier of making those people apply for permits, and that the fact that the Havenfields visitors, and visitors are not formal carers very often, the people that keep people going, give us hope and want us to continue living, are not necessarily our medical carers. We've got to get beyond this. This whole county and city needs to get behind the social model of disability, which is removing the barriers to full participation and inclusion in society. I'm not a driver. I'm reliant on people coming to visit me.
Ms Gilpin,
sorry.
I'm sorry to interrupt you because you're raising very important points about the whole
Probably
city.
gone off the point.
But the
sorry.
question specifically was about Mulberry,
Well,
Close.
combining, if you look at Mulberry Close and Ellis House is within Mulberry Close, we have a high number of residents who may not formally qualify for blue badge or formal medical model carers permits, but we are all dependent on our informal networks of carers, friends, family members who are dropping in. And at the moment, there is the benefit of unenforced on-road parking, and there is the benefit of Ellis House residents know that they are welcome to park in the privately owned bays by Mulberry Close. Of the 26 26 responses from Mulberry Close residents, 21 were objections, and the 4 that were not objections all have private off-street parking, which is the minority in Mulberry Close.
So, Ms Gilpin, I'm going to, sorry to interrupt you again.
Going around
Is that clear now, Councillor Robertson? Are you clearer?
I only have 2 microphones on at the same time. Yes, I think it is clear. It's a more general problem than I hadn't realised. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Gilpin. We have Rosie, Councillor Moore, please.
Thank you. So I do have some concerns about not including the north side of Arbury Road. Not just, obviously, we've heard very clearly the issues faced by Havenfield, but also they were mentioned in the report, and I understand there aren't very many of them, but the houses along Arbury Road on the north side that don't have off-street parking. I just wonder, obviously we've heard 2 different opinions, that A, the scheme won't be possible if the north side of Arbury Road is included, but B, it might be that in 6 months we find out that it can. What's the option of including the north side initially and then reviewing? Also, in terms of the 6 months review, is there money set aside to deal with any changes, and how much, or can you guarantee that any knock-on impacts, because we do know that when you set up a scheme, there are knock-on impacts. Will there be plenty of money available for new lines, new signs, or changes to the scheme? And then with regards to Herbert Street, I agree it's very complicated, but in my portfolio is waste and recycling, and I've been out there with the waste crews and the struggles that they face week in, week out to get the waste trucks down there. I'm surprised that residents in Herbert Street aren't more concerned about emergency vehicle access, because I know that for the waste crews it is very difficult to access, and just like to say they do a fantastic job. Thank you.
Thank you. We have Councillor Slatter, please.
Thank you. Yes, I'm also concerned about Havenfield as an example of a development built with built-in problems, not just because it was built when it was horse and cart time. I know I queried this when I was on planning, whether it was really logical, but that is the situation they're in. I would be interested to know whether the GCP have any expertise in guiding a setup like that into being able to cope with some limitations on parking. Because even if they're in the scheme, there will have to be a discipline in terms of who can park and where and why, and how do you cope with day-to-day changes and emergencies. Some predictable, some not. I am concerned, looking at it, the procedure that is required for the free medical passes. That is maybe something to look into while there's 6 months review going on. Because, again, it could be another area for digital exclusion because the application is all online through your GP, and I can see there being various issues to do with that. It has to be controlled. It cannot be just anybody, but it does need to be the ones that are considered to be priorities by the resident as well as their neighbours, because it's going to be a neighbours' issue at Havenfield. So I'd be glad to know if there's any expertise already, and if not, you need to acquire some with the management committee of Havenfield, whoever that is. And hopefully you can point them to places that have done something similar and not had war break out, which would be good. Thank you. That's my main concern. Herbert Street, if I was living there, I would find that really tough. I've never had to live in a residence an area where it's limited while I'm there. I've moved into main roads at no chance of parking, and I can see it being really hard, even though theoretically the county council owns the pavement and the road, and you can't park there unless we say yes you can. We don't want to be so harsh, but there obviously are arguments. If I missed it, I apologise, because some of us new to this committee have had to do an awful lot of reading in a hurry. Is there evidence on what sort of commuting is the issue? What are the problems that have arrived? It may be that Councillor Swift can help with that, because he's been doing a lot of door-to-door. He's probably a bit of an expert himself. But what are the problems that this is meant to be serving? Thank you.
I think I'm going to ask Councillor Nethsinger to come in now, and then back to the office.
Thank you. I'm coming at this from a slightly different perspective in that the part of the city I represent, I think, was probably the part of the city that had a residence parking area implemented just before the stop happened. And I thought it might be useful to share some of the experiences from Newnham while making this decision. So as with this residence parking scheme, the Newnham one was quite complicated, and there was a great deal of consultation and a great deal of concern among the residents in the area about the impact of introducing residence parking. One of the biggest concerns was that there would be significant reductions in the amount of parking because the streets in Newnham are very narrow. And as with Herbert Street, we lost the parking down one side of a number of the residential streets in Newnham. And there was a great deal of concern from residents about whether that was going to lead to there not being enough parking. As it turned out, actually, once the commuter parking had gone, there was plenty, and there remains plenty of space for residents to park when the scheme is in force. And most of the pressure these days is for there to be more hours of implementation rather than fewer. Because the area does fill up quite a lot when the resident scheme is not implemented, and there are kind of knock-on impacts on further out areas. The other thing that we did a great deal in Newnham was think very carefully about the impact on the shops. We didn't have anything as difficult as the Havenfield issue. But there are some things that Newnham did which might be relevant to that issue and might be potentially helpful thinking about what might happen in 6 months' time when you review this. And one of those is that we have a number of bays where there is where it's possible for anyone to park, but for not a very long time. And in the Newnham case, I think that's half an hour, and I really ought to be able to remember this, but I think it's half an hour because those bays are intended for people to use local shops. A number of the shops in Newnham are quite small. You wouldn't want to use them for more than half an hour, but it allows people to come to the chemist or to use the shops. In the Havenfield case, I wonder whether one option might be to have a number, once you've established that actually there is enough space for the residents, as I suspect there will be, you could have a number of bays which were available for people to park for an hour and a half, which might not be the kind of, I mean, if you were going to park and go into town, an hour and a half probably isn't really long enough for that to be very sensible, but probably would be long enough to have a decent visit or to have somebody pick you up or drop you off. So I suspect that there are some practical things like that which could be implemented at the 6-month point once it's clear that there is enough parking for residents, but it won't be absolutely evident until you've introduced it, whether there will be. So I think I just thought it might be helpful to share that experience and to hope that the difficulties that residents are facing, and it is complicated and it is difficult and it does need really careful thought about each of the kind of different points of difficulty, that the 6-month point change might be really helpful in managing those. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Nessinger. I'll just bring Councillor Bennett, who hasn't spoken.
Thank you. And that's actually very good timing because I want to talk about carers, visitors and disabled permits, which actually risks off some of the points made by Councillor Netzinger. Lynn and I have had discussions on this in the past in the Making Connection schemes. Basic problem is not the parking permit scheme, but that the care industry is an abusive industry, which has some very questionable work practices, which I'm not going to discuss here. But one of the issue is that it's very hard to get carers to do short visits because they're not paid for travel time. So any difficulties in finding a parking spot or travelling could mean that care is denied. Permits tend not to work too well because the industry is so abusive, you get very high staff turnover. And so you'd continually have to be applying for new permits. Also, to try and get their insurance down, most care companies say that they don't do medical care. So that might prevent them from applying for some sorts of permits. I think, though, that Councillor Netzinger's short-term parking permits would be very helpful for some types of carers, and those are the ones doing a 4 times a day visit around meals and bedtime, because typically, and this is quite horrific, they're expected to get a meal out, check a resident hasn't died, and fill in their report and get back into the cars, in some cases in as little as 15 minutes. 30 minutes is now the minimum for reputable agencies. So a 45-minute or 1 hour short-term parking bay would actually resolve some of those problems quite neatly without putting the administrative pressure on the people receiving care, who might be seeing a different carer every week. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I'm going to take Councillor Shaler, who hasn't spoken, and then we'll come back to the officers.
Thank you very much, Chair. I just wanted to come back on a point that somebody made, and I'm sorry, I forget who it was, about on-street charging of electric vehicles. It's obviously desirable to charge from your own home rather than paying the charges at commercial charge points. This is something that Highways is working on. We don't currently have a way of getting the cable across the pavement, for instance, and even if you could, you can't guarantee that you can park outside your own house. But we are working on both of those problems, a way to get it charged across the street, and also identifying which vehicle is being charged no matter whose house it is being plugged into. So that might actually help with some of the problems that were expressed. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. So, officers, there's Councillor Moore was asked again about the north side. Can it, or Havenfield, can it be included now? What's the implications of that? And the 6 months review, and are there resources for that? And there was specific questions raised also about free medical passes, maybe in if it was approved in 6 months' time, or short-term bays for carers and visitors as well, and anything else you.
Thank you, Chair. In response to the question about including the northeast side of Arbury Road and then review. Can you hear me? Okay. The answer to the question is that in order to put in a different boundary, we would need to consult, which we could do in November at the earliest. So that would be how we would deal with bringing people in and then reviewing efficacy. And then there is, of course, the risk that you bring in a scheme that isn't working well and you then have to exclude people if you find that it's not working well. So that's the answer to that. In terms of the other houses on the northeastern side of Arbury Road that don't have off-street parking, there are very few. I think there are 2. The vast majority have a garden or a driveway that they park their car on. In response to Councillor Slatter on parking standards, I see your wider point on that. It's worth flagging that the amount of parking that Havenfield has is compliant, I believe, with current parking standards for that type of accommodation, although I recognise that that isn't one space per unit. In terms of your question about guiding organisations and limiting parking, it may be that there is scope for the Havenfields management to think about how they use their space and how they prioritise it and allocate that. That's not for me to say. We do have experience in the past of working with various firms who have done travel planning and things. That's largely in the context of businesses. And therefore, there will be a limit to which some of that expertise is transferable. But we can certainly ask around and see where we can provide support and resource if that is wished, but we obviously have no remit to impose any of that on a private space. But very happy to help if we can. Put them in touch with, for example, the scheme that run the car club scheme to see whether there can be shared cars located nearby and so on. In terms of what problems we're trying to solve and about the parking beat surveys that we did back in 2022, thank you, sort of set out there's various different stresses on various different roads. The stresses are greatest in the Chesterton Triangle and greatest on weekdays. And they set out the varying local demand. As I said, because of the reduction in parking in some areas across the scheme, that stress will then move around in a way that's quite hard to predict. And there is the added uncertainty of post-COVID travel patterns. But like I said, the evidence there is that traffic is coming back fairly strongly, albeit more concentrated to the middle of the week. In terms of, I don't think Councillor Netzinger asked me any particular questions, but I would just flag that the Asham experience was similar, in that there was a lot of concern about reduced parking spaces, and then actually there's enough capacity there now. There are no commuters that residents can more or less always find a space pretty close to their house. And in fact, there's some spare capacity there, which is sort of being capitalised upon by this broadening of this scheme, actually. And that's in direct contradiction to what people expected before the scheme went in, because there is just quite a lot of commuter parking in the sort of city centre fringes. And that's part of the point of bringing the scheme in, back to the problem. I take the suggestion on limited time bays, and that's definitely something we could pick up in the 6-month review if the scheme were to go ahead. And that point was made by Councillor Bennett as well, so sort of up to sort of 1.5, 2 hour is something we should definitely think about. And then the final point was just going back to the procedure on medical permits, which is actually a broader point than just the scheme, and that speaks to the wider resident parking policy that is county-wide. And so if I might, I will pass over to my colleague Nicola to come back on that one.
Thank you, Lynn. The residents' parking policy is at the moment being reviewed, so there's definitely a conversation to have about carers' permits and the criteria, but also taking on board Councillor Bennett's comment on how we're going to have to find a way forward, because there's going to be challenges, but definitely a conversation that we can have.
Thank you. Now, we're going to have a break within 10 minutes, because we have to have a break every 2 hours. So I think we have Richard Robertson wants to come back with a point. Councillor Moore wants to come back. Did Elise Manchin, are you?
She did say she could.
Okay,
She did ask
so
earlier.
could you be, yeah, okay, we'll go in the Councillor Robertson, Councillor Moore and Councillor Manchin.
Just a short point. The position of people who have got disabilities and have visitors from carers, personal, and carers, medical, is the same for all the other 24 schemes of residence parking zones in the city. If anything, I think it will be found easier to get the space for the medical carers to park, to visit when the scheme comes in. Not in every street, but I think there is a benefit from that. Carers personal is down to using visitor parking permits, and there's an extensive scheme. I think it's 100 permits a year. So it is, they're not free, but at least they do exist.
Thank you. It was just my point about if there was finance available to rectify any issues. And I just note that you've got one group of residents that maybe desperate is too much, but desperate to be in the scheme. And then you've got another group, Herbert Street, who don't want to be. Presumably, Herbert Street is crucial to the scheme, and you can't include Havenfield and not Herbert Street.
Thank you. To very, very quickly clarify, and I think some of this will actually answer the point that Councillor Moore just raised. To balance out the difference between scrapping the scheme now and going to consultation from scratch, as opposed to passing the paper now with a 6-month review, you will get to the changes you want quicker with the 6-month review. I can promise you this now, because if we vote this down today, then we go to November for a new consultation, which will last until beyond Christmas. It won't be able to come in front of us until after May the following year. And it will be more than a year before we even look at the results of the consultation, which would be based on exactly the same theoretical capacity data that we have in front of us now, i.e. it would be an oversubscribed scheme that we wouldn't be in any good position to recommend without changes. If we're able to do the changes as part of the 6-month review, you will have more parking immediately as a result of the commuters essentially disappearing, because these people can disappear. Commuters can go somewhere else. And that will allow us to make an informed decision, which we can implement quickly, about including those people that we would like very much to be included when we now have the ability to say what we've got capacity for. We are not going to forget about Havenfield. We're not going to pretend they're going to be excluded because they're not in the scheme and therefore they never will be consulted ever. That is nonsense. Of course they will be. It is my expectation that we will be able to accommodate you. What we've got in front of us is a roundabout way of doing that in the quickest possible way. You will not be in any scheme if we keep scrapping what we carry forward. So essentially that would be my understanding, and I hope it's clear enough. If we were to propose today, will take Herbert Street out of the scheme and put Havenfield inside again. This is a consultation that will take at least 18 months. It's not possible. It really will not work for Milton Road as a whole.
Okay, officers?
Sorry, Councillor Moore, for missing that one. There is budget set aside for the 6-month reviews, and fortunately, these schemes are not a lot of capital works, they're largely signs and lines, so the costs are not too great in terms of making changes. On your question on Herbert Road, I guess I would just point out that although there are a lot of people objecting, actually there was 71% support from those that responded from Herbert Road for the scheme in the 2022 consultation. So it's not correct to say that Herbert Road don't want to be in the scheme. It's never that straightforward, unfortunately.
Okay, committee. Now, I just want to say a few things that before we go to the vote or the recommendation. One is it seems like there is a lot of weight being placed on the 6-month review. And we've heard from the ward councillor concerns and about whether it would be a proper review. And I think the officers need to know that we're very serious about this 6-month review. It needs to be carefully done. It needs to speak to the Havenfield residents and have feedback. And also in the period up to that review, we would be looking at free medical passes and short-term bays, look at possible solutions in advance of that. I also would like to, the point raised by Ms Gilpin about digital exclusion and accessibility. I think this is a citywide issue, and I think that we as a committee, I would like to make a commitment to look into that and see where we are as a separate item that we will come back in due course. So I'd like to ask the committee to agree that. And then finally, it was also, if this committee was, that there would be some help offered to the Havenfield residents about how they might review their parking. Just, Councillor Snape.
Thank you. Just following on from what you're saying, the usefulness of a 6-month review. We recently had an issue to do with 20 mile an hour in another part of the county, and I believe that there was an email address established that could be used for comments. And I think something like that would be very helpful. I don't think that's quite as digitally exclusive as some of the online stuff we have to access. So I think that would mean that councillors could just chase. And if I do come up with a really good example of something like Havenfield that has managed to monitor, for example, and deal with the problems, I would contribute that. And no doubt the chair will just be checking that you are dealing with the things that have been brought up by the public. So would that be a possible thing? Ask, please.
I think that's something that can be included. So based on those comments, I'd like to go to the committees to see if you agree with the recommendation. It's that the Executive Director of Place and Sustainability in consultation with local members approve the introduction of the Milton Road Area Residential Parking Scheme as published. So to approve a review of the on-road parking in the affected area 6 months after the residential parking scheme commences operation. So those in favour, could you show your support or not? I think that was a unanimous support. So now, committee, I'd like to thank you all. It's been a very long session and a lot to consider. We're going to have a 10-minute break now, and if you could come back at 6:10, please. Item 5, which is Vinery Road one-way experimental traffic regulation order. This report is on Vinery Road, the one-way experimental traffic regulation order, and it will be presented by the County Council's Principal Active Travel Officer, Claire Rankin. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, good evening. So yes, my name is Claire Rankin. I'm the Principal Active Travel Officer in the Active Travel team at the County Council. The implementation of the modal filter on Vinery Road at the width restriction was undertaken in September 2022 as part of the government-funded Active Travel Tranche 2 programme, and which was then discussed at the December Highways and Transport Committee. Following implementation of the modal filter, we received quite a lot of feedback, particularly from St Philip's Primary School, that there was an issue with a lot of vehicles turning at the entrance to the school to then exit back onto Coldham's Lane. Following further engagement with the school and local members, it was proposed that the one-way section of Vinery Road North be reversed so that vehicles could exit onto Coldham's Lane. This was implemented under an experimental traffic regulation order in July 2023. So just to recap, an ETRO, so that's in place for 18 months. It's basically a trial. And then people can object to that trial in the first 6 months of implementation. We received some objections sort of just before the implementation regarding, after they'd received a letter about it, regarding ease of access to properties and requesting additional age markings, and these were put in at the same time as the scheme was implemented, and some of the lining was refreshed as well. There was some feedback from residents after implementation about some contravention of the reversal of the one-way, and so some changes to signage was put in, some additional signage on Coldham's Lane as you approached Vinery Road. There were also some objections about safety concerns of vehicles exiting onto Coldham's Lane from Vinery Road. This wasn't an issue that was raised as part of the road safety audits, both pre and post implementation, and we have been monitoring it. There have been no collisions around that junction since the one-way reversal was put in. I mean, inevitably there's been some increase in traffic on Vinery Road North as vehicles come through, but generally local traffic or those that are delivering to the shop. But the larger vehicles, you know, they couldn't get through. They had to turn around go back onto Coldham's Lane with the width restriction, and that's still is happening. So that increase in traffic has to be balanced, obviously, with the amount of traffic the amount of turning movements that's reduced since the reverse was put in, as vehicles can simply go out onto Coldham's Lane the other way. So for that reason, we ask that the committee supports making the ETRO permanent.
Thank you. Now, we haven't got any public speakers, but before we open to debate, I'd like to ask any of the local members if they'd like to speak. So, Councillor Shayler, would you like to speak on this?
Thank you, Chair. I've consulted with some of the people at the school and in the area, and as Claire points out, there was some objection earlier on, and this was about people not complying with it, not used to it, but also there was a certain amount of resistance from those who didn't want the bollard and the restriction on Vinery Road anyway. They felt that this would actually make the scheme more viable, which they weren't necessarily happy with. As it's been left in, it seems to have worked very well, and it has done what we expect it to do. And so I haven't had any real objection to it after that initial flurry. And so for myself, I'm quite happy. We're still getting some vehicles parking at the restriction at the barrier, which would make it difficult for emergency services to get through if they need to. But I think that's in hand. Going to get some yellow lines there or some other help to comply. But otherwise, I think it's a very good scheme.
Committee, are there any questions or clarifications? Councillor Bennett.
Hi. Vinery Road is the nearest post office to Abbey Ward, and residents have concerns that the current owner of Vinery stores has put it on the market because of the drop in turnover, which he ascribes to the bollard. And if so, we may lose the post office service because a new applicant will have to requalify for the post office. But there's nothing in this application that will change this because it's already been triggered, it's already up for sale. But I do have concerns that, you know, we have lost an important local facility as a result. It's particularly Abbey Ward because we have so many people working from home.
Any other point? Anybody else want to? Councillor Robertson?
I just want to strongly support the scheme. It's very unfortunate that the road narrowings got vandalised and the people who did that sort of thing just end up with closing the road completely, which is actually a better solution anyway. But I very much support the scheme.
Just to add that we are proposing to put double yellow lines at the road closure, but that's sort of going through the TRO process at the moment.
Do you know about this post office closing? Is there evidence why that's happening?
I mean, to a certain extent, that debate was had during the December committee at the Highways and Transport Committee, where it was debated whether the modal filter should remain or not, and which I suggest is a different issue to the reversal of the one-way. But you know, I take on board that that was an issue and that was quite extensively discussed.
Thank you, Councillor Shaler.
Thank you very much, Chair. I could add a little bit about the post office. I have been talking to the owners throughout, and having been in the area for 30 years, for most of that time, that post office was not as successful looking as it is now, in fact. So the recent owners have actually improved it and enlarged it, and it certainly is much better than it has been for the previous, I don't know, 20, whatever it is, years. And so as far as footfall, there it seems to have gone up. The other thing I could mention is that in the residence parking scheme that we were designed into shopping parking spaces there, which are 30 minutes, no return kind of shopping spaces, specifically for people who want to drive and shop or need to drive and shop. Thank you.
Well, we all want to support local post office. So, committee members, if there's no further debate, we'll go to the recommendation. I shall read it out. It's recommended that the Executive Director of Place and Sustainability, in consultation with local members, approve the experimental traffic regulation order on Vinery Road as set out in the report be made permanent. Can I see those who support this? That's a unanimous decision. Thank you, officers. Now we'll go on to item 6, which is to consider objections to proposed weighting restrictions in Headley Street, Eagle Street and Hazel Street. So the final report is on the proposed weighting restrictions of these streets, and it will be presented by the Policy and Regulation Engineer, Gary Baldwin.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, this is concerned with considering objections to weighting restrictions on the Ironworks development, which is built on the site of the old council depot off of Mill Road. This was requested by the City Council, Initially, the scheme was to have double yellow lines on virtually all the roads, with very few exceptions. We consulted on that, got quite a lot of feedback on that. Some objections, but also a lot of support as well. But in light of the comments received, the City Council amended the proposal to provide some short stay parking spaces, a disabled bay, and also a car club space. And that necessitated us having to reconsult on the scheme. And so we did a sort of second round of consultation. We got a lot less feedback on the second round and only 4 objections that time around. Quite a lot of support, 17 support as opposed to 4 objections and sort of 3 neutral responses. So the sort of assumption is that really the changes that was made to the scheme were actually sort of welcomed by most people. So we're sort of recommending that the revised scheme with the extra sort of parking provision is introduced.
Thank you. I'll now invite members of the public to present their questions to the committee. Could I remind you that you have 3 minutes to present your questions. First one is Mr. Martin Lucas-Smith. So I'm afraid our lovely amber lighting system is, we do not have it anymore, but I have a timer. I have a timer, and I will nudge you at 3 minutes to wrap up if you haven't done so already. So you can start whenever you want.
Thank you, councillors. I strongly welcome this support. This report, it's long overdue actually, given the situation that's now on the ground. To be honest though, I don't really understand why this is even being subject to any debate. You should just be able to, you should adopt it straight away. Both of your authorities have already decided the situation. What is proposed is basically implementing what the county and the city council have already agreed. The county council highways team provided the usual highways advice, which specified the amount of parking, which the City Council accepted, and the City Council implemented the plan application, which again sets the numbers out. So it should be straightforward. There should be literally no reason whatsoever to vote against this. And in fact, to do so would make a mockery of both the planning and the highways common process, given you've already been through that. In the lead up to the plan application, there was an extensive debate in the local area about the level of parking the site ought to have. Here is the design and access statement I've fished out, and it states very clearly the level of 0.65 spaces per dwelling, which is what has been implemented, and that matches the surrounding area. And I have a copy of the officer report here as well that also sets out all the numbers. So again, I just don't think there's really any debate here. What's now happening on the street is basically laziness. We have a huge purpose-built car park available that's probably added about £20,000 to the cost of every house to build. But some people are avoiding paying for parking, freeloading. And you can see this example, which is very typical, pavement parking, completely blocking the pavement, people blocking crossing points and so on, blocking the major cycle route that's going through there. Here's one of a car parked over tactile paving, which I think is particularly disgraceful. Essentially, it's just laziness that's going on here. And it's about time that these are implemented. It's also clear from the design that the streets are actually too narrow for parking to be allowed anyway. They were not designed as a width that allows parking and passing by. So it's very clear that if you were to go against this, you would essentially be creating a pavement parking problem for the long term because there would be no alternative. I do have one concern, which is that the allowance of a few spaces, which seems to be beyond what the council agreed, could become the thin end of the wedge as time goes by. I'm not quite sure why short stay spaces are being added, but I can see that it's useful to have deliveries and so on. Clearly, blue badge spaces, absolutely no problem. They're welcome, and again, they were already agreed, so there should be no problem there. I have one question. How long will we have to wait for implementation? The development's been occupied for about a year. Yellow lines are already painted, and yet there is a free fall that's developed. And I think this is a classic case where there's a bit of sort of out of syncness, if you like, where new developments go in, problems are created, and then we have to kind of row back. And I think this is a bit of a lesson again for the future that this sort of TRO really should be, it should be implemented very, very quickly as soon as the development is built, so that there's absolutely no ambiguity as to what's going to happen when people move in. Sorry, I went 10 seconds over. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now, Mr. Alan Smith.
Well, it's fine. It's very interesting to me to kind of be sitting here talking to you, because I was originally involved in the SPD creation for this back in 2016, as I think some of you were as well. And back then, we were very certain that there was going to be no parking allowed on the site. It was 0.65. I think the original proposal was 1. I remember Hill being involved in 2018, and us trying to, Hill convincing us as part of the SPD that we needed an underground car park. Today, that underground car park largely goes unused. Well, not largely unused, it is used, but there are empty spots. Those spots were made available to residents for £20,000. They weren't sold. They have been passed over to the City Council, I believe, where residents can, if they wish, rent them on a weekly basis at £20. The nearest comparable parking is at the train station, which is £50. So the £20 actually feels very reasonable. I moved into Headley Street from Cavendish Road. I moved from one constituency to another. And I've been there since December 2020. There are residents who have wheelchairs who live there. There are 3, perhaps 4 council houses which are purposely built for accessible purposes. There are residents who live there who require guide assistance, guide dogs. This is a perpetual problem. We have people who park and abandon their cars. They block paving. They block the pavements. People are forced out into the road. I don't understand why we need to sit here today and discuss this. This should have been a joined up meeting whenever it was decided in an SPD in 2016. Why are we sitting here almost 10 years later having this very discussion? It kind of strikes me a little bit. You know, I'm relatively young, I think, in this room. However, I've been talking about this since my early 30s. It just seems a little bit outrageous. So I would propose that we not only support this, but we try and look at a more joined-up approach in future. CIP, as we all know, is part owned by the City Council. The City Council can't line this up with their own organisation or company that they own 50-50 with Hill. I don't really understand how any developer has a chance. I do have 3 questions. So my questions come down to the implementation of the TRO. I have been speaking to a senior police officer, and I've been speaking to local authority solicitors who assure me that the TRO, if it goes through, will be enforceable, even though the road itself is unadopted. I would like clarification on that, because there seems to be some confusion about whether or not an unadopted road can have a TRO applied to it. I've heard both sides of this discussion. The funding, as part of the SPD as well, there was an agreement that Hill or CIP would provide funding for the redevelopment of the junction with Headley Street and Mill Road. I believe that funding has been made available or is available for use. I'd like to know, when are we going to see a redesign of that junction? Because pulling out, I own a car, which is interesting sitting here, but I own a car with a garage and somewhere to park it. It's interesting pulling out on that road because it is dangerous to pull out on, not only just because of the vehicles that are blocked on the bottom of Mill Road, but actually cars do speed down Mill Road Bridge. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now invite the local members if they would like to speak. So Councillor Richard Howitt, you are the county representative.
Thank you. It's no secret that you are my City Council colleague, so I'm sure you may wish to make some personal remarks as well, as will my good City Council colleague Richard Robertson, who no doubt is also on your list. I would like to thank the 2 constituents who have just spoken. I will speak very briefly because I agree with everything they've said. You know, what I've learned from this is that there wasn't joined up work between the county and the city, and also that it's just dismally slow, the process of adopting the highway. And there are lessons to learn in terms of new developments, and I hope officers here will reflect on that, because it's been painfully difficult for the residents in this scheme. Now, not a new scheme, but one which is getting to be relatively mature, and still we haven't managed to deal with the parking issues. I will only simply say what has been said about assurances given at an earlier stage not being followed, and this now finally being what residents want to see very accurately reflects local opinion as far as I see it. And I want to place on record my thanks to the City Council, because I think you've taken the initiative here in order to try and get this resolved, and I congratulate you for doing so.
Thank you. Well, Councillor Robertson has been working very hard on this for a very long time. Councillor Robertson, would you like to talk on this?
I would, and I think I can answer some of the questions we've already had. 3 years ago, we anticipated what would happen when the residents were able to move into their flats and houses, and that was parking would be all over the streets without control, unless a residents' parking scheme was brought in. We applied to the County Council to have a scheme, and were told it was not possible to have a scheme until the road was adopted, because the yellow lines couldn't go down until it might damage the road. Complete rubbish. Eventually we did manage to persuade the County Council we could have a TRO, because the City Council owns the land. The TRO has been applied for by the City Council. It will take another couple of years before adoption of the road comes along. The sewers have to be adopted first, then the road. We knew this would happen. We were refused. So anyway, we've now got to the stage of a TRO is before us for acceptance, I hope. All the residents moving in were made aware that there would be restricted parking. The tenants living in the council flats were all told by letter that that's what would happen. Unfortunately, some of them deny this, but it is a fact that they were warned that there would be a very restricted parking on the area. It's all part of the design of this scheme to have very little parking on the roads. And that's as described by one of the speakers, that it was never intended to allow parking on the roads to any great extent. There are at moments, of the 50 spaces in the underground car park allocated for tenants, only 17 have been actually taken up. So there are 33 spare spaces in the underground car park available for tenants. The flat owners, leaseholders owners, bought there were an allocation of parking spaces for flats where they were bought, and they bought theirs, so they pay an annual service charge, a small one, but they don't actually have to pay an annual regular rent. The rents on the council of 50 spaces have been set at just around £20 a week. However, there is a review going on at this very moment, and the next meeting of the review committee is on Wednesday, to try and reduce the charge for the underground car park, partly because in the underground car park there is no specific space that could be allocated to a person renting a space in the underground car park. There are lots of EV charging points, and therefore they have to be available for everybody. Therefore, you cannot allocate a particular space. And the fact that the security of the underground car park is not as strong as it should be is an argument for reducing the charges that we're putting on those spaces. So that's a hope that we'll get that implemented fairly soon. It's not certain, but we hope it will be, in time for this TRO to come in and enforce the parking restrictions that have been promised for so long. The position on the street at the moment has got so bad we had to have some barriers, red and white barriers, put down there to stop people parking on the corners and on the places where people are supposed to be able to walk across the road. Those have been moved out of the way again. But enforcement will come. Once we get this TRO in place, the City Council will employ the County Council's existing parking enforcement team to cover the ironworks streets as well as the other streets of the city. That's the way it will work once we've got it going. And it's imminent, but it's not quite there yet. The bays were the short-term bays on the streets of the area were in the original planning permission given to the site, and there's also a space for a club car. Again, it was in the planning documentation that there would be such a space. There's one additional parking space has been found outside the community centre, and that one is new, but otherwise it was all as planned. There were no parking on any of the streets except for those 6 spaces. So I hope that you'll take up the opportunity to pass this TRO forward for implementation. Thank you.
I'm also a city ward councillor. I just want to say that I've been aware of similar situations where people have moved in and roads aren't adopted. This is the most aggressive abuse of local parking I've ever come across. There, people hover waiting for the residents to move out from in front of their homes, and people will pop in and park in designated spaces in front of homes or in front of garages, blocking garages, and then just going to the station and being away for days at a time. So this can't come soon enough. Thank you. So are there any questions or debate, Councillor Moore? And I think there were a few questions from the, to come back to the officer as well. So we'll just, Councillor Moore first.
Thank you. I am in favour of this scheme, but I'd just like to say I don't think that £20 a week is affordable for everybody. And so I think the review is very much needed. Just following on from not our last item, but the one before, and the suggestion with the 1.5 hours, I know that some of the public speakers don't think that the 30 minutes spaces are needed, but would an hour and a half be more suitable then to also allow for things like carers and visitors? Because presumably we're removing all of the spaces available for visitors and carers. Thank you.
And I would like to go back to the officer now.
I think Councillor Robertson very helpfully sort of answered quite a few of the comments actually, so I'm grateful to him for that. There was a question about why we're still debating it. It was agreed at planning, and I accept that, I agree, but the planning process and the traffic regulation order process are two completely different things, and even if it's agreed at planning, we still have to go through a traffic regulation order process because that's the law basically, to give people an opportunity to comment. But I do acknowledge the frustration around the fact that it's been slow. Bearing in mind, of course, that some of the highway requirements are actually laid down by the county's own highways development officers. So, yeah, I understand that one. I can't really comment about the underground car parks as the county has no control, but I think Councillor Robertson helpfully answered that one. We do know that there's quite serious parking problems around there at the moment. What else have we got? Oh yeah, how long will it take to implement? Well, I understand from the City Council and their developers that are responsible for the works that most of the works have already been done, but they're struggling to get some of the final bits of road marking done because of parked cars, etc. We know that it takes a little while to get the adoption sorted out. It's always like that. I can say that you can, if you put a traffic regulation order in place and you've got the required road markings, it can be enforced, but there's got to be a sort of an agreement between the City Council and our parking services people to actually go and take action against parking in that area. But it sounds, again, from what Councillor Robertson said, that those discussions are already ongoing, or, you know, something's in hand anyway. So that, the delay, there shouldn't be too much more of a delay. There's nothing more much to do on the TRO once we've approved it. That's okay, it's just the signs, and as I say, the adoption is a bit of a side issue, and that can be overcome by some sort of agreement. What else have we got? I think most of the other ones, there was a question about funding of a junction improvement. I don't know anything about that. Unfortunately, my role really is just to process the traffic regulation order, but I'm sure if there was some requirement in planning to fund some junction improvement, then it will probably happen. Yeah, I think that's about it. There was a question about the time limits. Councillor Moore raised that one, and whether that could be lengthened. The problem with that would be there would have to be some sort of further mini consultation on extending the hours, and that would be problematic, and I think that would be frustrating if there was further delays. So it might be as well to just put the scheme in as is, and then potentially consider a review at some later date if the times prove to be too short. But we didn't really decide on the times. It was something that was sort of given to us, if you like, by the City Council. So I'm not sure what the thinking was, but I think, bearing in mind the community centre, they wanted something that would provide sort of short-term parking, really. But yeah, so I think that's answered most of the questions.
Thank you. Councillor Robertson.
The works on the access road, there were two requirements. One was to narrow the access outwards, and that has been done. Pavement has been brought out, so the road is narrower than it was. The other one was to adjust the railings on the parapet of the bridge at the bottom, near the junction, and that also has been done. I'm not aware of any other highway improvements that were required on that junction. It isn't safe, I agree, but that's what we've got.
We can have a look and just check that everything is sorted. Councillor Shayler.
Thank you very much. Just a very quick observation. It seems like people are a little bit frustrated about the timing that these things take, and it's always takes time with the adoptions and working out commuted sums and all that sort of stuff. But it is kind of frustrating where there's obviously a sequential process, and it seems like there's a stop between each one when we know that the next one is coming. And I wonder if there is any learning that we can put into that. I know there's a lot of frustration about the A1307, for instance, similar kind of problems there. It takes time to get to the next stage always. Maybe we just need to explain these processes a bit more or something.
Councillor Slatter.
I didn't, but I did want to say that we've been here for quite a long time, and I don't think anybody has spoken against the scheme. So I wondered if we could make a decision, and then the debate could be ongoing afterwards.
Councillor Moore did have some. Councillor Slatter, is there?
I could ask Gary afterwards.
Okay. Can we recommend the Executive Director of Place and Sustainability in consultation with the local members approve the implementation of the traffic order regulation on Headley Street, Eagle Street and Hazel Street as set out in the report. That's unanimous. Final thing, does anyone have comments on the agenda? If you have comments, I suggest you speak quickly now or send an email to Nick Mills. Okay, the next meeting is the 18th of September. Thank you all for this long meeting.